So maybe I'll just start by saying that my name's Marina Morrow, and I'm here today with Ian Anderson and Alex Verkade. It is June the 25th at about 2:30, and we're here to talk about the history of some of the different community mental health organizations in Vancouver. So maybe what I could get each of you to start with is I thought we'd start with the MPA, since both of you have a long history with that organization. And so maybe Alex, you could start by just telling us how you came to be involved in MPA and sort of what the circumstances were.
Involvement started in December 1975. I'd been living in Vancouver for about 6 or 7 months at that point in time. I was kind of at loss as to what I was going to do. Right. And I'd been walking by the MPA drop-in center on U Street for about 4 or 5 months, not knowing what it was, thinking it was a place for juvenile delinquents or ex-criminals, all that kind of stuff. And a lady friend of mine took me there. And I happened to look at the paper, and they were advertising they were going to be doing their every 6 months hiring of coordinators. I went there and I ran in the election with about another 100 candidates running for one of the 6 drop-in center positions. I didn't succeed.
Right.
But I also found out about their residence program, which was a place where you could live. It was like a group home setting. And what made it different than from the boarding homes was that the members made all the decisions. Virtually every decision was made by the members, like who moved in, who had to leave, what the menu was for the week. Everybody in the house would have a chore. I eventually moved into one of the houses. Right. Every member would have their chore for the week. Every member would cook one night during the week for the house. And I did that for a while. And while I was there, at that time they had a job coordinator, and she took an interest in me. And I was put into a make work project. Okay. And I was lucky that it fit my skills. I was in charge of helped run a drop-in center in the Riverview grounds. And at that point in time, when I left the house where I've been living in, the members at the house decided they would like me to replace the person who was leaving. He left because he didn't like the fact that MPA no longer was under all these temporary make-work projects for the coordinators. Right. And we're now going more legitimate, so he decided he wanted to leave on principle. And the members decided they wanted me to come back and be one of their coordinators.
So is this still in 1975?
Yeah. I was then elected by the members to do the job. Over the years, I did numerous other MPA positions. And I was instrumental in the formation of a project called MPA West. What happened was basically a real estate agent saw a chance to make a large commission and a chance to get his brother into stable housing. So the problem was there was no salary money attached, so none of the resident staff wanted to touch this project and I made an agreement I would set up the place with certain conditions, that there'd be a steering committee to set up the project, and each member of the steering committee, if they wanted to be voted, if they wanted to participate, they automatically were guaranteed a suite, and we would determine what kind of building we wanted, and it was determined we would do housekeeping units, 5 housekeeping units within a building. That was fine, and we still were voting people in and out ourselves. And then what happened was there were some problems. Right. What happens? And it was then determined that there would be a steering committee to help us make those kind of decisions, which was fine for a while. And then the new executive director determined he wanted to totally control the process. Right. And pretty soon, what had been we voting our people in and out with no program, all of a sudden morphed into a situation where the housing manager determined who moved in and out of the house. Right. And the members no longer had any say as to who they were living with in the building.
So let's pause there just for a second, because I want to bring Ian in and just ask him kind of how you got involved and if it was the same time period or if it was earlier or later.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Ian Anderson. I'm on the board of directors of the West Coast Mental Health Network again. I was on it in the 90s for 2 or 3 years as well, and it was resurrected again by Bob Carton in 1999. And anyways, my introduction into NPA at 6th and U in Kitsilano, we imagined it to be like almost the center of the universe. Then glass windows all around the drop-in center, easily broken so many times and replaced the windows. But anyways, I was discharged, released from Riverview Hospital. I spent there February 1st to June 10th when I was 18, 19 years old after my 6 shock treatments there, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2-week period. And I was just released, discharged to Loma Lodge, a boarding home at 1872 West 10th, Barden 10th. And then, so I walked through the doors of MPA, 6th and U, Kitsilano, June 10th, June 1974. And I noticed right away that everybody was in a different tune there, groove, or how can I say, mood, or uplifted, sort of more livelier, and compared to the institutions or hospitals. And so I noticed that they seemed to be more self-empowered, and so I knew there was a better way, and I joined the Mental Patients' Rights Movement, which I've been in for 35 years now or more. And I did work around NPA and volunteered, as well as run for elections. In 1979, I was a relief coordinator for that went on holidays I got elected for. In 1982 as well, I had a temporary job as a coordinator there at the MPA, and then I helped write my poetry in a nutshell, the newspaper that was very prolific and flourishing, thriving in the MPA, the nutshell newspaper that they provided for the membership and anyone else who wanted to read it in the community. So that was very well good run publication, and I met a lot of people. I don't like to call them ex-mental patients or even to call people mental patients. The politically correct term now is mental health consumer. And so anyways, as things went on, I met some incredible people. One person in particular I don't want to mention, but anyways, he inspired me to no ends, and he is still alive. He still exists in the community, and he did a lot of good work for MPA, and I can't mention his name here because I don't have the permission from him to mention his name, but Alex Verkade knows him well, and I do too. And he was at the conference one year in the 90s when I first I was in Unity Housing Association, and at the AGM of the West Coast Mental Health Network in the 90s, I was at Unity Housing Association members, co-founders, and workers of Unity Housing swept the board of directors of the West Coast Mental Health Network, and the person I'm still talking about that's anonymous, he wanted 3 people to make a quorum, wanted to carry that motion, or make that motion pass through, and I stopped him. I said, no, you can't do that. We gotta have 5 people for a quorum, not 3. And he said immediately to me, he said, what are you gonna do, kill me? So that's my friend, our friend, good soul, good sport. He's done a lot for mental health.
Right.
And, but anyways,
Yeah, maybe we could just pause
Yeah,
it
go
for a
ahead, go
second,
ahead.
just because John's,
Yeah, I was thinking, I'll sign the form, and I really want to make a comment on MPA because I really love the organization, and
okay, okay.
but
You wanna do that?
can I continue?
Do we? Yeah.
We'll just pause it for 1 second.
Okay.
Oh, good, good.
All right.
Okay.
It's
yeah,
recording.
hi, my name's John Hatfull, and I also was passing by MPA on 6th and U, and I looked in through the window, and there was this group of people, and I was really new to Vancouver, and I was just wandering around really aimlessly. So I went into the drop-in center, and I started playing ping pong, and I just getting to know the people. And you know, there were these huge meetings that took place, and the meetings were, the drop-in center was a really warm, kind of cozy place with windows kind of all the way around, and the people stood in a circle, and there, when I was there sometimes was 100 people at the meeting, sometimes 200 people at the meeting, and what would happen when somebody spoke, they'd enter the circle and address the group.
Right.
And so we really talked about all kinds of things, the running of the center, what really had to do with the mental health issues at the time, and the mental health movement as far as consumers were happening were just really starting. And MPA was you know, known around the world as the leader, the cutting edge. And here we are, we were in the middle of it. And the way it worked is you would be on a committee, and after a while you were given responsibilities and for running the drop-in center, taking care of the people. And one of the really nice things about it, there were apartments above the organizations where all the people lived, and it was a real community. It was like there were no divisions, mostly everybody was equal. You couldn't tell the difference between the staff and the patients, and you know, it was all kind of a very communal kind of operation, and there was no professionalism there. There was just people working together to do the cause. And you know, my memory plays funny tricks, but as I recall, everybody was getting the same kind of wage. Is that right, Alex?
Actually, that was partially true. What happened was that everybody got the same base rate of pay.
Right.
But what happened was that there was a period of time where the pay was not that good. What happened was, to take into account, like if someone was married
Right.
and had children, we actually worked it into the budget that they would get a dependence allowance. So the person who was working for MPA, who had kids, could actually get a little extra money. In fact, we had a secretary who was so good that even though she had no kids, we voted her for dependence allowance.
Right.
But the interesting, you know, at the very beginning, when they were still doing the Make Work project kind of funding, the staff at that time, they gave money for the paying the staff, but they didn't. The old funding projects didn't pay for program supplies and things like that. So to show you the difference was now it's largely a career thing working for MPA with credentials and all that. Back when MPA started, the original staff members actually kicked back part of their salaries
Get right into the
to
organization.
run the organization, yeah. Because when MPA started, for the staff, it was largely a political statement. They were there because they had a strong commitment to making the organization run. And they many of them willingly gave up their jobs after 6 months and then lived on UIC for the next 6 months, and so that the money could go around. Nowadays what you have is, much as it's providing better services and more services, What you have now is you have a unionized staff who gets hired by managers, who get hired by an exec director, who get hired by the board. And now you need professional credentials to a large extent to work in the organization. Back when I started, I mean, how I got hired was I went there and I volunteered. And people say, hey, you know, Alex is pretty good.
Yeah.
Why don't we will elect him to be a drop-in center coordinator, and that's
Can
how I
ask
got
you
hired.
guys- So one of the things that you've been talking about is that it was meant as a political statement. So what was the statement? Like, what was it that people were trying to do with the
Well-
organization?
Well, I kind of like to jump in here because this is a real big thing for me.
Right.
And really what there was, you were accountable to the people that you were serving
Right.
in MPA. And, you know, if you did something wrong, you could be de-elected real quick. And so because of that, you give the best possible service you could for the membership. And there was a comradeship that there is no longer in. For instance, I was a drop-in center coordinator, and we used to have people who come in who were really drunk, really tough, really mean.
Right.
And if I got into a confrontation with someone like that, the whole drop-in center would stand up and we would take care of that person together.
Okay.
There is, if you go into a drop-in center now, there is no way that that's going to happen, or it's less likely to happen now.
Right.
And really, we were really, you know, looking to, you know, have housing. We were looking for the rights of mental health consumers. We did not hide the fact that we were mental health consumers, i.e. the name Mental Patients Association.
Right.
We, you know, were addressing, you know, the problems of mental health consumers and really dealing with them. And we were unashamed
Right.
of, you know, the illnesses which we had. And I have to say now, that really isn't the case.
Right.
People are hiding now and very private now, and there is, you know, we're talking about privacy, and really I think that's what the whole system uses to, people can't speak out anymore, people are more compartmentalized, you know, it is just not the same.
Right.
And, oh, go ahead.
Actual fact that you were an answer about the political statement.
Right.
See, before MPA came about, most mental health services in the city were run on the do-gooder model.
Right.
You know, you had people, professionals coming in and professionals making all the decisions, and they were well-intentioned, like organizations like CMHA.
Right.
But the people in MPA, original founding members, those I knew personally, I knew one of the two founders,
Right.
and I were quite close. They wanted to set up a system by which the consumers of the mental health service, so ex-mental patients, they controlled the organization, not professionals. And that was the difference. Where the other systems were working on a vertical organizational structure, MPA worked on a horizontal structure. Like every 6 months, you stood up for election. If you weren't doing your job, someone else got your job. It was very simple, although it didn't really work that way totally. If you're doing a half-assed job, I mean, mental patients are very sensitive and don't want to hurt people's feelings. So frequently, for the first 5 months of someone being hired, particularly in the houses, they would be bitching and complaining about how bad service they're getting. But every 6 months, regular as clockwork, they were rehire their coordinators.
All right.
I'd just like to jump in here and make a comment. I really loved the people who worked for MPA. I was always, you know, part of my problem is I have learning disabilities and I'm manic depressive, and that's really kind of a heavy-duty combination. But, you know, those people gave me courage to try. you know, and, you know, I can't think of an organization where I admire the people as much, or if I admire them at all, quite frankly. But the point is, I really did.
Right.
And it was a real motivating factor. And it is missing now. There is nothing like that now. And
I was going to let Ian jump in here and just.
Yeah, because what John is trying to say is that why MPA stood out amongst all other organizations, because it was member run, like a bunch of hippies, freaks ran it, you know. And anyways, beatniks, whatever,
Right.
yuppies,
committed
yippies,
people.
Yippies. Yeah, dedicated, devoted. They
Dedicated,
really were,
committed
they really were.
people.
They really were. So we had so many programs, activities going. We even had a pub night. We take the people, we have parties and pub nights, and we always had the coffee urn on all the time,
Right.
like 24 hours a day. We even had night watchmen that would stay in the drop-in center and watch the drop-in center overnight,
Right.
you know, and because we had all windows, we didn't want any vandalism, you know, because the whole drop-in center was solid wall-to-wall windows though, where the drop-in center, we went there to see it. Anyways, it's still there. It
Right.
hasn't been torn down, the building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the one, it's on U Street.
One of the
Yeah.
neatest things, which I don't think any other organization would have, for first 5 years, I think, when I was there, we would have the elections of the staff members, and literally what would happen after that general meeting, a whole bunch of people would all get together, and we'd all go down to the Cecil, or whatever, the
Okay.
hotel next
The
to
Yale or the
The
Cecil,
Yale.
it
Yeah.
depends.
Yeah, and you would have staff members, although we called them paid members and unpaid members back then, you would have paid members, unpaid members, and they'd all go together. I mean, only in MPA, like when I lived in MPA,
Right.
when I lived in the MPA West 10th house, it was not uncommon for me to go to my coordinator's house and go to a barbecue at her house.
Right.
Whereas in the regular boarding club program that way, I remember a woman actually got fired because she had one of her residents over to her house for dinner.
Right.
MPA wasn't totally utopic. I mean, you still had political dynamics in that you did have members who were more powerful by nature of their abilities,
Right.
or by nature of their, but it wasn't rigid. Like, you could be an unpaid member and be more influential than half the paid members.
Right.
You know, it was you.
Now,
What
did
you
the
put in, you could.
Well, I was just going to ask, with the paid members, so there wasn't really a distinction made between people who had been through the psychiatric system and people who
Actually,
hadn't.
there was a period of time where we actually had a commitment to try to guarantee at least 50% of the paid members would be consumers or ex-member
Okay.
patients. It didn't work out that way. Eventually what happened was that a vast majority of the people who worked in the drop-in center were consumers
Right.
or ex-mental patients. A vast majority of the people who coordinated the houses were not consumers. And that wasn't that the organization set up that situation. The problem was that the members living in the houses actually did not want to have ex-mental patients as their coordinators. So it was hard for someone who's an ex-psychiatric patient actually get elected by the other house members. But see, when MPA started, it started with virtually no rules. And necessity formed rules. You ended up with things like you had to have a no violence rule.
Right.
It had to have a no sexual or racial harassment rule. These all came about, but these rules were made by the members.
Right.
And eventually what happened, the organization, GVMHS, at some point just decided that that old system where the members running the joint
Right.
wasn't the way they liked it. So they said, okay, you want to keep your funding? You have to have a real board of directors. And not only that, we'll tell you who's going to be on that board of directors.
So what time period is this?
That would be in the late 70s. And what happened was that the staff, the paid members sobbed. I mean, they didn't want to see their jobs go on. So they all got their guys to come down and vote the new constitution in. GMHS basically said, you must have a board, you must have a lawyer on your board, you must have an accountant on your board, you must have one of our representatives on your board. For every 4 board members that we approve of, you're allowed to elect one of your regular people.
Right.
You know, it's...
And eventually that got overturned. Eventually that slacked off, and
Let John or.
Yeah. Oh, what happened?
I would say that's a
Okay, yeah. When the funders come in and they started really talking about accountability, the members who weren't really as knowledgeable thought that, well, the staff wasn't doing their work properly. We didn't realize that when they talked about accountability, that they were talking about that, they wanted the staff to be accountable to them and not to us. And when we realized that a lot of us fought the idea in the meetings,
Right.
and there was a real war that took place.
And then, again, would this be like towards the end of the 70s that this is happening?
Yeah, that's right. And really, the feeling, about really what took place, because really, the staff afterwards, they formed a union naturally.
Right.
And all of a sudden, what the members had and the accountabilities that members, had, with their staff just went up in almost like water vapor. It just disappeared. And that the old thing about unity housing, an MPA being inclusive,
Right.
it just disappeared, right? And really, when you stop to think about it, a lot of what you do if you're a psychiatric patient, you feel like you're separate from the society, from the community. And MPA was a bridge in that community. You could become somebody. You could become a drop-in center coordinator. And you could work for mental health. And your mental health could, earn something for you, a place in the community. And now that's gone.
Right.
Actually, what happened, the unionization came about
That's an interesting piece.
after the board was put in place for quite a while and was comfortably put in. The ministry then said, oh boy, thank you for setting up your board, but now we don't like this situation where we have a whole bunch of different people we talk to. We want you to have one person who is in charge of the whole schmeal, and we only deal with that one person. And when that person, see in the past, if the office coordinator, which later on became exec director, wanted to do something, that person would have to have the approval of the members. Now, he no longer did. So what had happened was now that you had an exec director with real power.
Right.
So the staff who used to be accountable to the members were now accountable to the exec director. So the union was formed because, literally, the union came about because the employees wanted to be protected against the exec director.
Right.
And what happened is that slowly, when the board first came about, hiring was still, members were still elected to staff, and then the board would ratify the decision of the members because they were legally accountable, and only the board could fire. Then that evolved when the first union contract came about, in that the staff now were still being elected by the members
Right.
and still accountable. And but in part of the clause in the union contract back then is that a union member was on the replacement pool, got first dibs at a job, and so you had a two-stage election. First, any internal transfer would go through, and they would run against none of the above, and none of the above never won. Okay? So literally, if you were a staff member, you got first dibs at any job as a union member, which then the managers started taking advantage of, because they would say, oh, I really would like to hire Mary in the drop-in center. Jane, then go to the residence manager, oh, could you mind terribly putting that person on your replacement pool? And so when the job came open, that person would then, and eventually the union said, no more of this.
Right.
We don't want none of this members hiring people. We get rid of those elections. So that's what happened to the elections. They were down the drain, and now you end up with a vertical
Kind of structure.
hiring structure.
So Ian, do you have anything to say about that when the things start to shift at MPA? What that was like?
the MPA was sold down the river. We didn't have much to be able to protest about. Anyways, what I'm trying to say also, many years later, when I was on the Vancouver Richmond Health Board for 6-year tenure in the 90s, right up to 1999, GVMHS was too powerful. John Russell was the executive director, I think, then of GVMHS, but they were too powerful, and the Vancouver Richmond Health Board took their power away. They restructured them, and because they were too powerful, they were calling all the shots, and the Vancouver Richmond Health Board didn't like that, and they were dismantled. They were taken apart, and I worked with the movers and shakers in the mental health field, the high circles, all quite a lot to my 35 years of mental health patients' rights movement work. And like I say, freedom of expression and freedom of rights were infringed upon, were violated in a way that there was no like intimacy. There was no more real sensitivity. It was more insensitive and callous and more dehumanizing. It was no moral support. You were referred to places. There's people that weren't familiar with you. There was no more familiarity. Like I say, I want to say something here now. When there is a saying, it's an old saying, and it says, familiarity breeds contempt. Well, like, I don't know where that saying came from, but to me, familiarity should breed fondness, right? It shouldn't breed contempt, familiarity. I don't know where that got that saying, familiarity breeds contempt, it should breed fondness. Anyways, a lot of the people in MPA, like I say, sometimes power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, that is the case, and some strange things happened in the early days of MPA when some staff members were corrupt, and it even happened in this organization, Coast Foundation Society, on accountability and corrupt staff members. And so anyways, but it happens everywhere, and so you have to be accountable, and if you're not accountable in this day and age, you don't last long. And things can get a little careless and a little reckless, or a little, just messy or untidy, and audits, paper trails, and actually in the West Coast Mental Health Network, formerly the Vancouver Richmond Mental Health Network, and we went back to the original name, West Coast Mental Health Network, was resurrected by Ron Carton, the coordinator, executive director, that stepped down just recently in May, and now we have a new coordinator, executive director, Adrienne Fitch, and she's a wonderful lady, and she's quite well qualified, and credit to her profession, and so now we've got a good board of directors at West Coast Mental Health Network, and we're thriving and trying to manage as best we can, and we're a consumer-run driven organization.
I'm gonna go back to that in a second.
Sure.
I just wanna,
Actually, I think just about the West Coast Mental Health Network, because there actually have been 2 West Coast Mental Health Networks.
yeah. So maybe actually, should we?
Okay,
Do you wanna
what
shift
basically
there, or
happened
do you
was the West Coast Mental Health Network, the old one,
Yeah.
which was a provincial organization,
Yeah.
and the new West Coast Mental Health Network actually evolved out of the Vancouver Richmond Mental Health Network. They changed the name to take into account that they were now covering areas outside of Vancouver. The original West Coast Mental Network basically came from activists from the old MPA.
Okay, that's what I was gonna ask. The link there.
It evolved out of it.
Yeah.
And the Vancouver Richmond Mental Health Network was one of the funded projects of the old West Coast Mental Health Network,
Okay.
which died.
See, my history with that was with Helen, when Helen Turbot was running.
Yeah,
That's
she was.
So that's
Yeah,
how,
she
that's
was.
the first time I heard about it.
What-
Yeah.
She was the staff member in charge of Vancouver for the West Coast Mental Health Network.
Right.
she was hired by the West Coast Mental Health Network Board of Directors at the time, and I was the coordinator for the rest of the province.
Okay.
Actually, my job came about by fluke. What basically happened was there was a provincial mental health conference,
Okay.
policy forum. And the West Coast Mental Health Network got the contract to look after consumer involvement in this. And we did such a good job of administering, we did most of the administration for the thing, that they let us keep the position.
Right.
So that network was actually funded 50% by Vancouver GVMHS and 50% from the head office via contributions from the rest of the province.
Can you go back just for a second to make the link for me between MPA and the West Coast Mental Health? So how did that, so at what time period did that happen? And
Okay, I'm trying to
'cause you
get the
saying it was-
exact
so it was-
date.
So it was MPA folks that started
That
the
would
West
be,
Coast?
let's see now, that would be in the late 80s.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, it was. It was
Okay.
MPA.
And one of the more forceful members, and it involved consumers from outside MPA also, it just so happened that the first real executive director happened to have also been a coordinator at MPA at one time, and he was a manic depressive.
Okay.
And he was, and at that point in time, I was recruited to go on the board of directors. I was a secretary treasurer of the board, and the executive director kind of liked me. Actually, he thought I was going to be a very good yes man for him. It didn't work out that way, because what happened was, shortly after I got hired, he wanted to do some scheme how he could get 3 salaries out of 2 salaries and all that. And his doctors decided, why don't we take him off his medication? So then he went full-blown manic, and he ended up in the hospital, and everybody was going, oh, that idiot, he went off his medication. It was actually a stupid psychiatrist who did it, and he ended up in forensic. So anyway, then I took over, and I continued on doing the job, and they got a new executive director, and GVMHS gave the West Coast Mental Health Network a lot of money to set up a Vancouver program,
Right,
and one of those programs ended up being Unity Housing.
right.
But eventually, I think the network lost its direction. I mean, near the end, you had a disillusioned staff, you had a board which was too much controlled by Unity Housing. You had a new executive director who was more interested in protecting her own ass
Right.
than she was in doing the job, and she started dipping into provincial funds to fund head office. And eventually, all kinds of things happened. Eventually, the provincial government just said, listen, we're not going to risk our keys to the executive washroom by taking fund. And the region started saying, hey, listen, we're paying X amount of dollars towards a provincial organization. Why hasn't anybody come out to our region?
Right.
So eventually it folded on its own volition, and the projects then went off to different things. GVMHS took care of some of the projects, like the art gallery, and the Vancouver Richmond Mental Health Network went off to the Self-Help Resources Association.
Right.
Unity Housing was given a Shepherd Committee, and the Shepherd Committee, the leaders of the Shepherd Committee then decided, oh boy, well, I'm going to incorporate a new society. And
Right.
so all the agencies went off, the funded agencies went off, and eventually it all ended up as incorporated separate societies.
Separate societies. So
And
I'm just going to ask John here, what point did you get involved in
Well, Alex asked me to, I was really, in MPA, I really was really sorry for the loss, and then the West Coast Mental Health Network started, and I could see that maybe we could reincorporate some of the things that MPA had, right? And I always thought I was pretty hard to house. So when we got the money, I started to house really hard to house people.
Right.
And so...
This was with West Coast.
Yeah, this was with West Coast Mental Health Network.
part of the Unity Housing.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
one of the projects.
So we had guys in there that were actually pretty smart, really together, but had kind of like a little bit of a street bent. And we were, I guess there was a certain amount of wildness with it. And we really since our experience with MPA, we didn't cotton to authority too much.
Right.
Yeah, we were
So-
like a cult. We were actually like a cult.
Yeah.
We
So,
ran it right into the ground.
well, Ian, we did not say that, right? We didn't really run it right into the ground. It's just that we overextended ourselves.
Well, yeah.
Myself, I was a great line worker, but I was really, when it came down to it, I was really not an office person, and I couldn't take care of the office part of it, and I had to really rely on other mental health consumers. Like I had a person who would take care of the money, and he turned out to be a Jewish guy and really, really good with money. The unfortunate part of it, he was a mental health consumer, and he got really, really ill. And so we lost control of it. It turned out one day he threw all our receipts and billing into a big field someplace.
Right.
And, we couldn't withstand an audit, and neither could the West Coast Mental Health Network, because they were a part of all of this. And Unity Housing had, a large amount of money.
So
Actually-
I just wanted a clarification. So Unity Housing came out, when did that start and where did that come in?
Actually, it started about the year following when the Consumer Family Initiatives got funding. The problem with the network, what we did was we let principle outweigh practicality. What happened was, rather than, normally when you have a group of new people who don't have the skills necessary, as an organization you gradually extend
Pull people-
autonomy,
yeah.
you gradually extend responsibility. So here we have a group of people, well-intentioned people,
Right.
with no administrative skills whatsoever.
Well,
And all of a sudden, can I just finish?
Okay.
We'll let you jump in.
No skills necessary. So you ended up with all kinds of bad things happening. You ended up with too much, overextending too many houses for too little money.
Yeah.
You ended up with a situation where you end up dipping into damaged deposits to keep the organization running. You forget to do your receiver general payments. You do all these things, which you end up doing the payroll wrong. You don't end up having a track of who's living in the houses. You don't end up with a track of where the money's coming from, where it's going to, all these things. And you have a group of people who really don't like authority, so you try to tell them you have to do things in a business-like fashion, and you don't get a very, very strong response. All these people, no one in Unity Housing ever profited or pocketed any extra cash. There just was no cash flow.
Right.
So eventually we had to step in, because the government had to cough up for cash to bail out the missing receiver general payments.
Right.
And then you start having members who are just disenchanted for some reason. They go to the funders saying, "No, no, 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 no." And half the things they put to those funders were not accurate. So, yeah, that
You get this moment.
it
what
was
did you
things like that in the
wanna
other
say?
projects, which led to the downfall of the network, because then GVMHS, you had the regions mad at you because they're not getting the services they want, and you have GVMHS mad at you because you're not properly supervising
Right.
your funded projects. So first the provincial aspect decided to pull all funding, and then GVMHS had to pull the funding. So
Right.
then what happened one day, the head of the head funder from the provincial government just walked into the office and said, "Okay, each got a month. You
Right.
can either continue working for a month and get paid for the rest of the month, or you can leave right now."
Right.
Yeah. And some of us stayed on and
Right.
tried to leave unmuck whatever mess that was left behind before we disappeared, you know.
Ian,
The-
I was going to let Ian just jump in for a sec because you.
Yeah, in the beginning, when John Hatfull and John and I are the co-founders of Unity Housing Association in a way. My family helped. My mother helped a little bit in getting houses, helping John with houses, procuring.
Right.
And my sister Elizabeth, who's 9 years younger than me, she lives in Nelson with her husband Bill Brooks. But before they got married, Bill Brooks and my sister Elizabeth, he was the van driver for Unity Housing Association. And Bill and Elizabeth, my sister Elizabeth, was the business manager that helped Victor Kerman.
Okay.
And they helped immensely with Unity Housing to get things happening. And It was all, we were one big family, the Unity Housing Association. That's how we felt. We felt so close and comfortable and so warm-hearted towards each other and generous and sharing. And we had lots of meetings and we tried to pan things out, hammer things out. You know, if it was unconstitutional, unethical, we dealt with it. We dealt with crises. We had peer support networks set up, preventive measures. We had all kinds of programs, activities. We had a thriving thing going on, thriving business. Human rights was good for business, right? And so, but anyways, I was going to say something else important.
How many homes how many housing spots does Unity have?
Well, you know, right now we have 6 houses. Yeah, but at the time when I was getting a lot less money, we were getting about 67,000. I had opened 11 houses, and I figured when I opened the houses, people would see the need for all these extra houses, and we would get the funding.
Right.
You know, because I could show that they were full. You know, but really, you know, the funders were not really impressed with me opening all these extra houses, and I really stretched the dollar way too thin. Right? We just couldn't really manage it. The extra funding didn't come in. My gambit really didn't work, and so that was really part of the problem. The people were very, very close as like we were back in the days of MPA. They helped one another. We housed all kinds of people. We took, you know, people in, right? Even when we didn't have room for people, we kind of made room for people.
In the end.
Yeah. You know, and so, you know, really, you know, fundamentally, the spirit was there.
Right.
But you know, the dollars were stretched too tight, and the people that we had in, right, like we didn't really have all that many staff in Unity Housing. We had all these houses, and the people that lived in the houses were really they were, you know, kind of hard to house. They had real rough edges, and so there was always something going on, right? And we just, you know, couldn't manage it, and eventually we really had to cut back. And it was really, really very unfortunate that that this took place, right? We were all really well-meaning at the time. We just really weren't, we just didn't really have the whole picture there, you know what I mean?
You know, the funny thing was that after the Shepherd Group took over, and after the Portland crew took over overseeing Unity Housing, magically, even though they cut back from 10 houses down to 6 houses, actually 7, pretty soon I became 6, all of a sudden, magically, they doubled the funding. Okay.
You know, if they had doubled the funding.
Magically, all of a sudden, they doubled the funding. And so in actual fact, they're spending twice as much money and serving half the people.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of interesting?
Yeah. Because I'm not in conflict of interest. I didn't get a job description out of all this or whatever job. I was disability pension, which has been on for many years, and I do work, but I freelance my services. I do have a certain mental health worker certificate degree under my belt from Douglas College, the West Coast Mental Health Network funded me to go to Douglas College to get a mental health worker certificate degree in the 90s,
right.
1994. And anyways, when John Hatfull and I first got, the grant was for $67,000 the first year, and he got a check, the first check he got of that it said on it 20,000 houses. 20,000 houses said it. Now, how could that be a clerical error?
Right.
Right? You know, Unityville, 20,000 houses.
Yeah.
We cashed it anyway. We got it in the Credit Union Bank on Commercial Drive.
Right.
And so now when I was on the Record Self Board, we had a meeting. It was a private meeting with Rainfield and of GBMHS and Karen O'Shaughnessy of Lookout, Jean Green, and Jeffrey Ross residents. Anyways, we work well together, Karen O'Shaughnessy and I, on the board of directors, West Vancouver Richland Health Board, and I was there to approve funding or ask the funding of Community Housing Association. And the last thing that John Hatfull said to me at the Fleming Street House after we had a nice time that night, John said to me, "Keep the faith, Ian."
Right.
And I was thinking about all those people in all those houses, those 11 houses,
Yeah.
you know? In a way, John and I were like, he was my nemesis, John. and I was there. One guy walked into the Uni Housing office one time, a member of ours, Brian Baya, and he said, "Oh, there's God on the telephone. Oh, there's John Gordon over there, the Pope, and there's Ian, the Archangel, Ian the Archangel." You know. Anyway, so what happened was that I said, "I'm not going to ask the funding." It was $323,000 for the next year or two.
Right.
And anyway, so I said, "With these stipulations, amendments, and corrections and improvements, I want the funding to go through green light." And that was how it went. And community housing still exists now today. It survives, and it's going to flourish and thrive. I'm
Right.
sure. Mark my words.
Yeah.
Everything's going to be, some good is going to come of it all, and there's better days ahead.
Well, what I'm hearing is this.
Sometimes it's got to get worse before it
Before it
gets
gets
better.
better.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention there's Ian, and I know John Gordon wouldn't mind me saying something about him. And it'll sort of give you an idea about Unity Housing. John Gordon was a seminarian. In other words, he was studied for the priesthood, and he thought that we should treat the people of Unity Housing like the way the church would treat it. In other words, the people in Unity Housing were like our flock.
Right.
And we really took care of our flock. And John really was a prolific writer, and I'll bring in some of our pamphlets I didn't think of today. But he wrote them up, and if you take a look at our pamphlets, you'll get the early spirit of Unity Housing. And it was really about sharing and taking care of one another. And really, that was the old spirit of MPA, and we did our best to try to emulate it, really. And so, really, I thought I'd mention him, and I'm sure he'd love that.
Right.
One of the things that Unity Housing, they had a whole bunch of ideologues, people. What Unity Housing lacked was bureaucrats. You know? I mean, see, as a bureaucrat, as a consumer who happened to also been a bureaucrat, you learn things like you learn, oh, you could fudge on this, you could fudge on that, but you can't fudge on this, you know?
Yeah.
You can learn that there's certain keywords which raise people's hairs up and things like that. And that network had that problem. It just gave too much authority to too many people too quickly.
Right.
It gave them more authority than they were able to handle. The other thing that I noticed in the change in Unity Housing and in MPA
Right.
and in the network was that the less power the members have, the less they're willing to contribute. So you end up with a situation where when, like MPA, when the members ran the joint,
Right.
a lot of people did a lot of unpaid work. Now what happens is you end up having people sit back and say, well, someone else is getting paid for it. I don't have any decision making. Why should I put my ass on the line? Why should I put all this extra effort in? So you end up with a very compliant group of people who just sit back and rather saying, wanted to have, we will do this together,
Right.
they get the mindset, what are you going to do for me?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, we're doing new for our country. What
And
can our country
that
do
is,
for us?
in the nutshell, is what the problem with the new West Coast Mental Health Network comes pretty close
Yeah.
to the old MPA
Yeah.
feelings.
Yeah.
But MPA, God bless their souls, they are providing better services, they're providing more services. A good example was that when MPA started, they had an opportunity to run boarding homes.
Yeah.
And the people back then said, no, we will not do boarding homes because you cannot run a boarding home and still maintain the consumer control. Eventually what happened was the executive director, and probably the board too, even though the board of directors, for the most part, until I left, rubber stamped whatever the executive director wanted to do,
Right.
decided there's big money to be made. We cannot keep our group homes filled anymore. Let us convert some of our buildings into licensed facilities. I think now they run 5 or 6, I don't know how many licensed facilities they run, but they run a bunch of them, and they are bureaucratic nightmares. As for someone who actually was involved in the rewriting of the provincial guidelines towards licensed facilities,
Right.
I helped co-write the new the regulations. It is very top-heavy. I mean, in these places, you don't pick your own doctor. You don't pick whatever drugstore you go to get your medication. Everything is determined for you. The person in charge is accountable to nobody.
Right.
Even in the private facilities, even the owner of the facility can't tell the person in charge what to do. And that's totally against the original concept of consumer-run organization. Now you have management-run organization. It may provide the best services in the world,
Right.
okay? But it's no longer management-run. I think one of the best things, even though at first I thought the original reason why MPA changed its name to motivation, participation, action, or whatever the new MPA logo is,
Car and
that,
treatment,
that people were embarrassed about being mental patients. Some of them were being called mental patients. I think it's a great idea because the new MPA, much as it's a good organization and provides good services, is not the Mental Patients Association. When I left the board, just before I got onto the board, I'm sorry if I'm rambling, they set up a nominating committee as to how you got to run for the board of directors. You couldn't run from the floor anymore.
Right.
They set up a system by which you had 3 members on a nominating committee to determine if you're allowed to run or not. And the breakup was there was supposed to be 1 honorary member, which is a non-consumer member, 1 board member, and 1 consumer member. Eventually what they did was they took the honorary member off the board, and they picked a consumer who was on the board, and then they picked another consumer. So you end up with 3 people on the board determining who was and was not allowed to run for the board of directors. And some qualified candidates were actually being screened out.
Right. Just on the basis of that structure.
Just on the basis of the fact that one of those people didn't like the person. So it's really interesting how this radical organization, where you started with people actually kicking back funds and doing everything together, is now, although a very successful organization, is no longer consumer run.
Yeah.
Now, the bureaucrats may think that's wonderful and they may provide better services and all this stuff, but you've basically taken an organization which had 20 staff members and now it's over 100.
Right.
No, but the point is, in Unity and MPA before, what you had was some kind of therapy that worked.
Right.
It was a housing organization and it had therapy. It got people to move from dysfunction to function, right? And, right now, there isn't anything out there that gets mental health consumers to really function. There is no incentive like it.
Right.
The old MPA, for instance, it's just like, right now you have to have a college degree to practically work in MPA or any other of these associations. If you can imagine the old association where you're on welfare and the next thing you were making what a professional would make.
Right.
The volunteerism this created because you were operated through committee and then you worked part-time and all of that.
Yeah.
It's such a giant incentive that it got not only the people who were really employed working at MPA, but let's say 20 more people per person who worked for the organization because there was this incentive that took place.
Right.
A dynamite idea that's gone nowhere. And I'd just like to make a point. John Gordon, who was, put his heart and soul into Unity Housing, is now at a long-term care facility because He has two illnesses. I don't really want to go into it too much. But really, what's happened to him, he's a 45-year-old person, and now he's living with old age pensioners.
Right.
And the mental health, will not move him out of that facility. They can't find another place. And, he is, he's afraid he's going to live in that group home or that facility, that long-term facility, for another, 30 years. And the people that he's with, right, who he makes friends with, who are in their 70s and their 80s, he's had maybe 5 really good friends, and they've died.
Right.
They just, and John Gordon is now being institutionalized, and it is a real crying shame. And really, that's what the system has come down to. And I don't know, I guess I'm off topic with all of this, but someone who has worked real hard and contribute towards the system, and he has to wind up like that is just terrible.
Yeah.
Actually, I'd like to make a comment, not about John Gordon, but about, see, I've been very lucky. In 1975, I was near the end of my rope, and I quite frankly was considering, as Hamlet said, to be or not to be. Okay? I was coming close to doing the old Lionsgate leap.
Right.
Okay? Because my life was going nowhere. I went to MPA, and all of a sudden, I had a chance to be part of something. And someone in MPA thought I was worth saving. And they helped me get into a project, which led to me eventually becoming an employee. Eventually, I must confess, I was not honorable. I did some dishonorable things, and I ended up leaving. Then after that, I left. I ended up working in a 7-Eleven, and I got mentally ill, really mentally ill. Okay. Then someone who I'd worked with at MPA thought I was worth something. And he brought me onto the board of directors of the West Coast Mental Health Network. Okay? That really changed my life again. And all of a sudden, I had something to believe in again. Okay? I earned it. I did a lot of work. I helped him do the budget for the subsequent year. And because of that, the West Coast Mental Health Network, which hired only mental health consumer survivors, believed in me enough to hire me. I then spent the next 7 years or 8 years working for that organization. And quite frankly, just previous to me becoming a board member of the West Coast Mental Health Network, my fiance told me to go take a flying leap. Okay? I was wondering, I was like 37 or something like that years old age, and I really was thinking, I'm probably not going to last till I'm 40. I'm probably going to commit suicide before I turn 40. Okay? That didn't happen. Basically because some organization, even though I did not have my high school diploma, I only had my GED tests, they believed in me enough to give me an opportunity to work. No other agency, no other organization would have hired me back then. Okay? Even with my shortcomings, the network believed in me enough to give me a job. And I worked for them diligently for a considerable period of time. Every once in a while I had to fill in for the fact that, because we were consumers, and frequently, and to be honest with you, most of the time in most organizations, it's people with mood disorders who end up running the organization, because that's less of a disability than having schizophrenia as far as running things. So you would end up with people having bad patches. In the network, we had 3 full-time provincial staff members. Any 2 of those could cover for the third person. Right. So frequently I would cover for the exec director. It taught me a lot. I mean, in the final year working at the network, I ended up with a head injury, which has restricted my ability to work now. I can't think of any other organizations that would have given me the opportunities I've had. I now work at Unity Housing as an honorarium employee. I lived in Unity Housing. The reason I moved into Unity Housing basically was that the provincial funders said to me, because I used to always go to bat for them when they had their little administrative glitches, okay? I would go to the guy in charge of accounting and things like that they would phone up, the exec director would then phone me because there was an oil and water situation between Unity Housing and the person in charge of Vancouver, so I usually interceded. I would go to the guy at GMHS and say, okay, you got this problem with this little thing? I'll go deal with it. And I usually went and I cajoled them into solving the little problem. You know, because you have to understand, I didn't have the authority, so I had to cajole. And one day he said to me, if you really believe in Unity Housing that much, why don't you live in it? At that point in time, one of the houses had a vacancy, and I knew the person who was their house rep, and he basically said, why don't you come and live in our house?
Right.
And taking into account, I knew that the provincial networks was on borrowed time. I knew there's no way I could survive on welfare
Right.
in a place with 2 cats. So I said, okay, I'll move in. So I moved into Unity Housing, and I did the same thing there. I worked up, I did volunteer work, and for most of the last 11 or 12 years, I've actually been one of the honorarium employees, making $200 a month I've done a variety of little jobs for Unity.
Right.
It's another organization, you know,
Yeah.
where the fact I'm a mental health consumer was actually a bonus,
Right.
not a detriment.
Yeah, you
And
know.
eventually I got my own place, and I still work, for another year I'll be doing honorarium position at at Unity.
You know, right.
And that's the important thing, is that when you have a professional model, it doesn't allow very easy involvement in mental health consumer survivors in running the organization.
Yeah.
And that's the
difference.
That's the biggest concern I have, is that the network, New West Coast Mental Health Network, does have a structure which allows for all their employees, all their honorarium employees, all their things, to my understanding, are all consumers.
Yeah.
Whereas I would think that in MPA, I don't think there's a single consumer survivor in their management team. There was one of the first real exec director was a mental health consumer, although he didn't publish the fact.
Right.
But I don't know. I don't know how many managers have been consumers since then.
Yeah, I just want to say that Unity Housing still does the same thing. We have about 12 jobs in Unity Housing, and we have 26 positions. We have one person who really isn't a mental health consumer, who is our executive director. And really, she just does the paperwork and all of that. And the people in Unity Housing run Unity Housing. So really, we give people responsibility. We have jobs like Alex's job. He tears apart and puts together computers and teaches people computers. We have a resource person, we have office personnel, we have 3 outreach people, we have an activity person, and we have all the house reps, and they all get money, and they run all the houses with a little bit of help from the staff of Unity Housing. So it really, really works. The thing is, what we would really like to do is would really like this Unity Housing to grow.
Right.
And really, there doesn't seem to be any money from the government. There doesn't seem to be any room for growth at all, as far as an organization like Unity Housing that wants to do more than house people, that really wants to use the housing organization in a therapeutic kind of way, where we train people to actually work to bring them in, to actually have them be a part of the community where they really don't hang their head, where they can be proud of really what they do.
Right.
And I just don't understand why that isn't a part of mental health and housing.
Yeah.
I just don't get it.
So
Well,
this
there's
is,
no
so
real
that's, no real.
The government is not at all. See, consumer involvement was flavor of the month for a while.
Yeah.
Okay? It's no longer flavor of the month. Okay? Now, the people in charge in provincial government and in the regional mental health authority, well, the provincial government has basically abrogated all control over health to the regional health district. So there is no provincial standards. And there seems to be no commitment on the part of government to actually encourage consumer involvement. I think there's a greater oomph into protecting your ass, protecting your key to the executive washroom. I think that seems to me, I could be way off base on that, but I get that impression that consumer involvement is secondary.
Can you, I know there's a story behind that key to the executive washroom. Does anybody have that story?
Well, like I say, is that I was at a conference of homelessness and mental health and drug addictions, a 2-day conference at the WAS Center just recently. Gregor Robson was there. You might have read in the newspapers about that. And Daryl Burnham was there, the executive director of Coast Foundation here. He was there on the panel, and I commented. But anyways, I was just Googling something on the computer today or last night. And the Criminal Fed Reserve controls all the governments. Criminal Fed Reserve controls all the governments. So the direction that people are going in. My mother actually said to me lots of times over the years or past months, she said, we're in the last days.
Right.
And a lot of us feel we got our hands tied behind our backs.
Yeah.
We can't do anything. We got everywhere we turn.
Like a wall.
We turn our cheek one way, we get slapped in it. We turn our cheek the other way, we get slapped in it.
Right.
We're not masochists. We're not living in sensory deprivation tanks.
Right.
That's what they're doing to us.
Do you think we could? I gotta go.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think
go
we're
ahead, John.
almost done anyway.
Well, since you're
Yeah,
speaking,
okay.
we'll let you go first.
Yes, hi.
Oh, wait.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good, and God bless you all. I love you all. It so happens that John Hatfull and I and a lady named Robin, when I was on the Vancouver Regional Health Board Mental Health Advisory Committee, we were on the Housing Subcommittee, and John Hatfull and I and Robin had a proposal grant that came out onto our desk on the Housing Subcommittee, and it was the Duke House. They proposed to have their operation. Now the Duke House operation is to do with battered women and families, to a shelter for battered women and families. I think something to do with that. And they wanted to have their operation above the Drake Hotel, a strip joint, a nightclub.
Right.
Yeah. And we told them they got to do their proposal all over again. They got to, we're not going to put their operation above the strip joint, pub upstairs there. And so we thought they were out of their minds, and so we just put axe their funding, red light, and we'll do it all over again. Yeah. So I want to say, that's all for now, folks.
Thanks. Ed.
I guess what I've got to say in closing is, if you give people an opportunity, a chance to do something about their lot in life, they will do it. Really, it seems to me lately, I don't want to be kind of talking about sour grapes, you know what I mean, but there really aren't that opportunities for people to kind of grab a hold of like they were, in the days of MPA and in the days of the network. It's far and few between, and really what mental health consumers need is that kind of opportunity where they can grow or where they can blossom. And I really hope that people seeing this kind of tape that we're making here will really, roll up their sleeves and, give us a helping hand to create or recreate this kind of thing. Because although we have all kinds of housing and great apartments, we don't have the kind of things that can bring mental health consumers really back into the community. And really, that's really what's needed, rather than mental health teams or care teams. That's all I got to say. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to finish, even though there's a certain degree of negativity I've expressed, I think there is hope for possibility in the future. But I think one of the things that consumer organizations or new organization has to face is size. If you get to be a large organization, it is very hard to maintain your consumer involvement. The sheer size of it makes direct democracy, which was NPA when it started. It was what's called direct democracy. It's very hard to maintain that when you get too large. You end up with what's called representative democracy, where you hire your board, you elect your board, and if you have good bylaws, it's fairly representative, and that's very hard when you get large. And you end up with an impersonal organization if you get too large. Those are some of the pitfalls I think any consumer organization has to face, is becoming too impersonal. MPA worked originally because it wasn't impersonal. It evolved into something which is traditional. MPA started off as an alternative to the mental health system. It is now it's now one of the largest organizations in the traditional mental health system. Alternative, generally you're better off if you're small. Traditional is what happens when you get too large.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. You were amazing.